The morning frost covered the grounds of Sandringham House like a crystal blanket, and King Charles stood at the tall windows of his private study, watching the early December sunrise paint the Norfolk countryside in shades of gold and amber. His fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea, steam rising in delicate spirals that reminded him of countless winter mornings from his childhood. The weight of the crown had settled on his shoulders only recently, but the weight of tradition had been there his entire life. Today marked the beginning of what palace staff quietly called the longest Christmas, a period that stretched far beyond December 25th and into the heart of winter. Most people believed royal Christmas traditions ended with Boxing Day, perhaps stretching to New Year's Eve at most. They had no idea that the real work of royal Christmas began when the decorations came down in other homes, when children returned to school, and when the rest of Britain settled back into ordinary life. Charles moved away from the window and walked to his mahogany desk, where a leather-bound journal lay open. The pages contained handwritten notes in his careful script, documenting traditions that had been passed down through generations but never spoken about publicly. These were the hidden Christmas customs that bound the royal family together long after the last carol was sung and the final gift unwrapped. The phone on his desk rang softly. "Your Majesty," came the voice of his private secretary, "the Norfolk families are gathering at the village hall. They're ready for your visit." Charles smiled, setting down his teacup. "I'll be there shortly, James. Please ensure the gifts are loaded into the Land Rover." This was one of the traditions that stretched beyond Christmas Day, the personal visits to farming families who worked the Sandringham estate. While the public Christmas broadcasts and official ceremonies drew media attention, these quiet January visits remained private affairs. Charles had joined his mother on these rounds for decades, learning the names of children, remembering birthdays, and understanding the real lives that existed beyond palace walls. He pulled on his worn Barber jacket, the same style he had worn for 30 years. The pockets were familiar, shaped by years of carrying small gifts for unexpected encounters. Today they held hand-carved wooden toys made by artisans at Highgrove, his personal residence where traditional crafts were kept alive through careful patronage. The Land Rover crunched over gravel as Charles made his way to the village. The winter landscape held a stark beauty that he had learned to appreciate during long walks with his grandmother, the Queen Mother. She had been the one to teach him that royal duty extended far beyond public ceremonies. "The crown belongs to the people," she had told him when he was barely 10 years old, "but traditions belong to us. We keep them alive not for ourselves, but so that something beautiful survives in an ugly world." The village hall buzzed with quiet conversation as Charles entered. Children pressed against their mother's legs, eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. These were not the polished public appearances that filled newspaper pages. These families knew him as the man who remembered their names, who asked after sick relatives, who had attended their weddings and christenings when cameras weren't watching. "Your Majesty," said Tom Peterson, a man whose family had worked Sandringham land for 4 generations. "Thank you for coming. The children have been practicing their curtsies and bows since New Year's." Charles laughed warmly. "I hope they haven't been too nervous about it. I remember being terrified of my own grandfather when I was their age." He moved through the room with practiced ease, crouching down to speak with the youngest children at their eye level. Each family received a personal gift, not something chosen by staff, but items Charles had selected himself based on conversations throughout the previous year. For young Emily Watson, whose love of horses had caught his attention during a summer fete, there was a hand-carved wooden stable complete with tiny horses. For elderly Mrs. Jenkins, who had mentioned her arthritis during a chance encounter in the village shop, there was a jar of honey from the Highgrove beehives, which she had once said helped her pain. "You remember everything," whispered Sarah Chen, a newer resident whose husband worked in the estate's organic gardens. "I mentioned my son's interest in astronomy just once, and here's a proper star chart." "Details matter," Charles replied quietly. "They're what make us human rather than just figures in ceremonial dress." The tradition had begun with his great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, who believed that the royal family should know the people whose lives were intertwined with royal estates. But Charles had evolved it, adding personal touches that reflected his own interests in sustainable farming, traditional crafts, and environmental stewardship. The gifts came from artisans he supported, made from materials grown on his own land when possible. As the afternoon wore on, Charles found himself in deep conversation with James Morrison, whose family had managed estate woodlands for decades. They discussed the ancient oak trees that lined the avenue to Sandringham House, some of which had been planted to commemorate royal births and marriages dating back centuries. "The big oak near the north gate is showing signs of disease," James explained, his weathered hands gesturing toward the windows. She's been there since King Edward's time, planted when your great-great-uncle was born. Charles nodded thoughtfully. Then, we'll need to plan carefully for her replacement. Trees are like traditions, they take time to grow strong, but, once established, they can outlast several generations if properly tended. This was another hidden tradition that continued long after Christmas, the careful stewardship of memorial trees and gardens that connected current royals to their ancestors. Throughout January and February, Charles would walk the estate with foresters and gardeners, making decisions about which trees to preserve, which to replace, and where to plant new ones. Each decision connected him to previous kings and queens who had walked the same paths and faced similar choices. The memorial garden behind the house held trees planted for every significant royal event of the past 2 centuries. Charles's own birth was marked by a sturdy English oak that now towered over the chapel where he had prayed as a child. His sons' births were commemorated by a pair of lime trees that had grown up together, their branches intertwining as William and Harry had once been inseparable. It's more than just maintaining grounds, Charles had once explained to William during a winter walk. Every tree tells a story. Every garden bed connects us to family members we never met. When you tend these growing things, you're having a conversation with the past and making promises to the future. The visits to village families continued for weeks after Christmas, extending into February when the weather turned harsh and travel became difficult. But Charles insisted on completing every visit, regardless of snow or freezing rain. Staff had learned to prepare the Land Rover with extra blankets and thermos bottles of hot tea, knowing that their king would not cut short conversations with elderly residents or hurry past children who had prepared special drawings or poems. These extended Christmas traditions had practical purposes beyond mere sentiment. The post-holiday visits allowed Charles to observe how estate policies affected real families during the hardest months of winter. He saw which cottages needed better heating, which roads required maintenance, and which families might benefit from additional support. The information gathered during these informal visits shaped estate management decisions that improved lives throughout the year. Mrs. Patterson, whose cottage sat at the far edge of the estate, served tea in her small front room while her grandson played with a wooden train set that had been a Christmas gift from the king the previous year. "The heating system works much better now," she told Charles. "That young engineer you sent round has made all the difference. These old bones appreciate the warmth." Charles made a mental note to commend the maintenance team and to ensure Mrs. Patterson's cottage remained a priority for any future improvements. These details couldn't be managed from Buckingham Palace offices or through written reports. They required personal attention, face-to-face conversations, and the kind of familiarity that developed over years of consistent contact. The afternoon light was fading as Charles prepared to leave the village hall, but one final tradition remained. Every year, on this particular day in January, he planted a tree somewhere on the Sandringham estate. Not a memorial tree for a royal event, but a simple addition to the landscape that would grow and flourish long after he was gone. This year's tree was a young oak sapling, its roots carefully wrapped in burlap by the estate's head gardener. Charles had chosen a spot near the kitchen garden where it would eventually provide shade for future generations of staff members taking their lunch breaks. The hole had been prepared earlier, and rich compost from the estate's organic waste program waited nearby. Charles knelt in the cold earth, his hands working the soil around the young tree's roots. This was work that palace protocol might suggest should be left to gardeners, but Charles had insisted on doing it himself for the past 30 years. The physical act of planting connected him to the land in ways that ceremonial duties could not. "Every tree is an act of faith," he murmured to himself, words his grandmother had spoken to him decades earlier. "You plant it knowing you may never see it fully grown, trusting that someone else will care for it when you're gone." The sapling looked impossibly small against the vast Norfolk sky, but Charles knew from experience how quickly trees could grow when properly tended. In 10 years it would provide shelter for small birds. In 20 it would cast meaningful shade. In 50 it would be a landmark that future kings or queens might walk beneath, perhaps wondering who had planted it and why. As he packed earth around the tree's base, Charles thought about all the traditions that would continue long after the media attention of Christmas faded away. The weekly visits to elderly neighbors would continue through winter's worst weather. The careful tending of memorial gardens would occupy quiet hours between official duties. The personal attention to estate families would strengthen bonds that made the monarchy more than just ceremony and tradition. The first part of royal Christmas traditions that never ended was this deep connection to place and people. It was work that couldn't be photographed or broadcast, couldn't be measured in opinion polls or economic impact. It was simply the steady, patient work of caring for a small corner of the world and the people who lived within it. The Land Rover's engine turned over in the cold air as Charles prepared to return to the main house. Tomorrow would bring another round of visits, another set of conversations that mattered more than headlines. The Christmas season might be ending for most of Britain, but, for King Charles, the real work of royal Christmas traditions was just beginning. Through the rear window, he could see his small oak tree standing straight against the winter wind, its bare branches reaching toward a sky that promised both storms and spring. Like the traditions he upheld, it would endure through seasons of change, growing stronger with each passing year, rooted in soil that connected past and future in ways too deep for outsiders to understand. The house lights glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, welcoming him home from work that would never appear in court circular announcements or royal biographies. But Charles knew it was among the most important work he would ever do, keeping alive the human connections that made the crown something more than gold and ceremony, something that could grow and flourish like trees planted in faith and tended with care. February winds howled across the Scottish Highlands as King Charles adjusted his heavy woolen scarf and stepped from the warmth of Balmoral Castle into the biting cold. The ancient fortress looked different under winter's harsh light, less like the romantic retreat that summer visitors imagined and more like the working stronghold it had always been. This was the season when royal Christmas traditions revealed their true purpose, when ceremony gave way to the grinding, essential work of maintaining connections that had grown deep roots over centuries. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he walked toward the estate's main stable block, where Highland ponies stamped their feet and snorted steam through their nostrils. These weren't the pampered horses that appeared in official photographs or carried royals during state ceremonies. These were working animals, bred for endurance and sure footing on treacherous mountain paths, essential for reaching the most isolated corners of the vast Balmoral estate during Scotland's brutal winter months. "Morning, Your Majesty," called out Duncan MacLeod, the head groom whose family had served at Balmoral for 5 generations. "More eggs ready for the high country if you're still determined to make those visits today." Charles smiled grimly as he approached the sturdy Highland mare. "More determined than ever, Duncan. Mrs. Campbell hasn't seen another soul since the new year, and young Tommy Ross has been waiting 2 weeks for his birthday present." This was the second great tradition that extended royal Christmas far beyond its traditional boundaries, the winter visits to families who lived in the remotest areas of royal estates, accessible only by horseback or on foot during the harshest months. While most people assumed royal duties became lighter after the holidays, Charles knew that winter brought some of his most challenging and important responsibilities. The leather saddlebags contained carefully wrapped packages, not elaborate gifts, but practical items chosen with intimate knowledge of each family's needs. For Mrs. Campbell, a widow who lived alone in a cottage 5 miles up a mountain track, there were hand-knitted sweaters from artisans Charles supported in the Outer Hebrides. For the Ross family, whose 10-year-old son had shown remarkable artistic talent during summer visits, there was a complete set of watercolor paints and paper that could withstand the damp Highland climate. Charles swung himself into the saddle with practiced ease. At 75, he was still an accomplished horseman, though the years had taught him to respect the mountain's power to humble even experienced riders. The path ahead wound through pine forests and over exposed ridges where sudden weather changes could trap the unprepared for days. Morag's hooves found secure footing on the frozen track as they began their ascent. The first mile passed through familiar territory, woods where Charles had hunted as a young man, streams where he had learned to fish under his grandfather's patient guidance. But, as they climbed higher, the landscape became wilder, more demanding of both horse and rider's complete attention. The tradition of winter mountain visits had begun with Queen Victoria, who believed that the crown's responsibilities included ensuring no subject lived forgotten or neglected, regardless of how remote their circumstances. But Charles had transformed these visits from duty calls into genuine relationships built over decades of consistent contact. He knew which children were preparing for university entrance exams, which elderly residents struggled with failing health, and which families faced financial hardships that pride prevented them from discussing openly. The wind grew stronger as they reached the first ridge, and Charles pulled his cap down more firmly over his ears. Below them stretched a valley that tourists never saw, a harsh, beautiful landscape where survival depended on self-reliance, community support, and the kind of practical knowledge that couldn't be learned from books. The families who lived here represented something precious in modern Britain, a way of life that connected directly to the land and seasons, unchanged by urban pressures or technological disruption. Mrs. Campbell's cottage appeared ahead, smoke rising straight up from its chimney in the still air that preceded a major storm. Charles could see her figure in the window, watching for his arrival. At 83, she lived alone by choice rather than circumstance, fiercely independent despite her family's efforts to convince her to move to the village. These annual winter visits represented her primary contact with the outside world, and Charles understood the responsibility that placed on his shoulders. "Your Majesty," she said as he approached the cottage door, her voice carrying the musical accent of the Highlands. "Come in before this weather turns nasty. I've been watching those clouds build since dawn." Her small front room was warm and neat, decorated with photographs spanning decades of royal visits. Charles recognized pictures of himself as a young man, awkward and uncertain in his early appearances at Balmoral. Other photos showed his mother during her prime, his father in naval uniform, and various relatives who had made the difficult journey to this remote cottage over the years. "How has the winter treated you, Mrs. Campbell?" Charles asked, accepting a cup of tea that was stronger and sweeter than anything served at palace functions. "I worry about you during the worst storms." "Oh, I manage well enough," she replied with the stoic cheerfulness that characterized Highland residents. "The new roof you arranged has kept me dry, and the improved heating system makes all the difference when the temperatures drop below freezing for weeks at a time." They settled into conversation that covered everything from local weather patterns to political developments in London. Charles had learned long ago that these isolated residents often possessed remarkably sophisticated understanding of national and international affairs, gained through careful attention to radio broadcasts and the occasional newspaper delivery. Their perspectives were invaluable precisely because they weren't shaped by urban assumptions or media manipulation. Mrs. Campbell unwrapped her gifts with obvious pleasure, examining the quality of the wool and praising the intricate patterns. "These will see me through next winter as well," she said practically. "I've learned to plan ahead when living this far from shops and neighbors." The conversation naturally turned to local concerns that affected the broader estate community. Mrs. Campbell mentioned that the mountain track had been damaged by autumn storms, making supply deliveries increasingly difficult. She also reported that young families were struggling with the isolation, particularly during winter months when even four-wheel-drive vehicles couldn't navigate the treacherous roads. Charles made mental notes about infrastructure improvements and considered how royal estate management might address the evolving needs of remote communities. These conversations provided intelligence that couldn't be gathered through official reports or administrative channels. They revealed the human impact of policy decisions and suggested practical solutions that bureaucratic processes might never identify. "I've been thinking about the old days," Mrs. Campbell said as she refilled their teacups. "When your mother was young and would come here with her own mother. Those were different times, but some things never change. The land still demands respect, and people still need to know they haven't been forgotten." This observation touched on something central to Charles's understanding of royal duty. The Christmas traditions that extended through winter weren't about maintaining quaint customs or satisfying tourist expectations. They were about preserving human connections that might otherwise be severed by distance, hardship, or social change. In an increasingly connected world, paradoxically, genuine human contact had become more precious and more rare. The storm arrived as they finished their visit, and Charles realized they would need to take shelter for several hours before attempting the return journey. Mrs. Campbell insisted he rest in her small guest room, a space that had accommodated royal visitors for generations. The narrow bed was made up with quilts that had been carefully preserved for decades, and the walls held watercolor paintings of Highland landscapes created by various royal guests over the years. Charles spent the afternoon helping Mrs. Campbell with practical tasks, splitting firewood, checking window seals, and reviewing her emergency supplies. These weren't activities typically associated with royal duties, but they represented the kind of direct, useful service that gave meaning to ceremonial roles. When the wind eventually died down and travel became possible again, he felt that both he and Mrs. Campbell had benefited from their time together. The next stop was the Ross family's small farm, perched on a hillside where sheep huddled together against the cold. 10-year-old Tommy burst from the house before Charles had even dismounted, his excitement overcoming the shyness that usually affected children meeting the king for the first time. "Your Majesty. Mum said you might not come because of the weather, but I knew you would. I've been practicing my landscapes just like you suggested last summer." Charles laughed as he handed over the carefully wrapped art supplies. "I made a promise, Tommy, and kings should keep their word. Besides, I wanted to see those drawings you've been working on." The Ross family represented a younger generation's attempt to maintain traditional Highland life while adapting to modern economic realities. They raised sheep and Highland cattle, but also operated a small online business selling wool products to customers throughout Britain and Europe. Their children were being educated through distance learning programs that combined local knowledge with contemporary academic standards. "It's challenging," admitted Sarah Ross, Tommy's mother, as she prepared tea in their small kitchen. "We want the children to understand their heritage and connection to this land, but we also need them to have opportunities we never had. Sometimes those goals seem to conflict." Charles nodded, understanding. This tension between tradition and progress appeared in every aspect of his own life. The royal Christmas traditions he maintained had evolved over generations, adapting to new circumstances while preserving essential elements. The challenge was identifying which changes strengthened traditional values and which threatened to undermine them entirely. Tommy proudly displayed his artwork, watercolor landscapes that captured the Highland scenery with remarkable skill for someone his age. Charles studied each painting carefully, offering specific suggestions about technique and composition. The boy's talent was unmistakable, but developing it would require resources and instruction that weren't easily available in such a remote location. "I might be able to arrange for a proper art teacher to visit occasionally," Charles suggested. "There's a wonderful woman in Inverness who specializes in working with young artists. She might be willing to make the journey once a month during good weather." These kinds of connections were another hidden aspect of extended royal Christmas traditions. Charles maintained relationships with artists, craftspeople, teachers, and professionals throughout Scotland who shared his commitment to preserving Highland culture while encouraging individual talent. The network operated informally, sustained by personal relationships rather than official programs, but it provided opportunities that might otherwise never exist. The afternoon was ending as Charles prepared for the return journey to Balmoral. The storm had passed, leaving behind crystal-clear air and spectacular views of snow-covered peaks stretching to the horizon. Morag moved carefully down the mountain track, her sure footing essential on surfaces made treacherous by ice and fresh snow. As they descended, Charles reflected on the day's conversations and the insights they had provided into the changing nature of rural Scottish life. The Christmas traditions that brought him to these remote locations weren't just about maintaining contact with isolated families. They were about understanding how larger social and economic forces affected people who lived closest to the land, whose lives remained connected to seasonal rhythms and natural cycles that urban dwellers had largely forgotten. The lights of Balmoral appeared through the trees as full darkness settled over the Highland landscape. Charles felt the satisfaction that came from useful work completed under challenging circumstances. Tomorrow would bring another round of visits, perhaps to the fishing families along the coast or the forest workers who maintained the estate's extensive woodlands during winter months. These winter journeys required physical stamina and emotional energy that formal royal duties rarely demanded. They couldn't be accomplished by proxy or delegated to staff members. They required the personal presence of the monarch, the investment of time and attention that demonstrated genuine commitment to the people and places under royal care. Back in the castle's warmth, Charles documented the day's visits in his private journal, notes about infrastructure needs, individual concerns, and promising opportunities for support or development. These records would inform decisions about estate management, charitable giving, and personal interventions throughout the coming year. They represented intelligence gathering of the most fundamental kind, direct observation of how policies and programs affected real people in their daily lives. The second phase of royal Christmas traditions that extended far beyond the holidays was this willingness to venture into difficult circumstances to maintain human connections that might otherwise be impossible. It required accepting physical discomfort, weather delays, and the kind of genuine engagement that couldn't be scheduled or controlled. But it provided something irreplaceable, authentic understanding of how the crown's responsibilities played out in the lives of people whose loyalty and service were measured not in ceremonial duties but in the daily work of maintaining British communities in some of the most challenging environments in the kingdom. The March rain drummed against the windows of Highgrove House as King Charles sat in his private study, surrounded by correspondence that most people would never associate with royal Christmas traditions. Letters arrived daily from craftspeople, farmers, artists, and small business owners throughout Britain, people who had been touched by the extended Christmas customs that continued long after decorations were stored away and carols forgotten. Each letter represented a connection forged during winter visits, a relationship that now required careful nurturing through the spring months that followed. Charles picked up a handwritten note from Agnes Murray, an elderly textile artist in the Scottish borders whose workshop he had visited during a February snowstorm. Her arthritis had worsened during the harsh winter, threatening her ability to continue the traditional weaving techniques that had been passed down through 6 generations of her family. The letter contained both gratitude for medical assistance Charles had quietly arranged and an invitation to visit her workshop during the spring lambing season, when she would demonstrate dyeing processes using plants from her own garden. This correspondence represented the third phase of royal Christmas traditions that stretched far beyond the holiday season, the careful maintenance of relationships that had been strengthened during winter visits. Unlike the public ceremonies that marked official royal duties, these ongoing connections required personal attention that couldn't be delegated to staff or handled through formal channels. Charles read each letter himself, often writing replies in his own careful handwriting rather than dictating responses to secretaries. He opened another envelope, this one containing photographs from the Ross family in the Highland cottage he had visited during the February storm. Young Tommy had used the art supplies Charles had brought to create a series of paintings depicting the changing seasons around their remote farm. The boy's talent had clearly developed since their winter meeting, and his mother's letter mentioned that the visiting art teacher Charles had arranged was proving invaluable for Tommy's education. The improvement in his confidence has been remarkable, Sarah Ross had written. He now talks about possibly studying art at university, something we never imagined could be realistic for a child growing up so far from cultural opportunities. Your support has opened doors we didn't know existed. Charles made a note to follow up on scholarship possibilities and to ensure that Tommy's artistic development continued to receive appropriate support. These interventions required delicate handling. The assistance had to be meaningful without creating dependence, substantial enough to make a real difference but discreet enough to preserve the family's pride and self-reliance. The phone rang softly, interrupting his correspondence. "Your Majesty," came his private secretary's voice, "the artisans from the Christmas workshop program have arrived for this afternoon's meeting. They're waiting in the blue drawing room." Charles smiled, setting aside his letters. This meeting represented another crucial element of the extended Christmas traditions, the annual gathering where craftspeople who had been supported through royal patronage during the winter months came together to plan collaborative projects for the coming year. Unlike commercial ventures or government programs, these partnerships were built on personal relationships and shared commitment to preserving traditional skills that might otherwise disappear in an increasingly mechanized world. The blue drawing room buzzed with quiet conversation as Charles entered. A dozen men and women had traveled from across Britain, representing trades and crafts that spanned centuries of British cultural heritage. There was Margaret Henley, the master bookbinder from Yorkshire whose workshop had been saved from closure through royal commissions. James Worthington sat beside her, the last remaining cooper in his Welsh valley, whose skills in barrel making had found new purpose creating planters and architectural elements for historic properties. "Your Majesty," said Eleanor Price, a master potter from the Cotswolds, "we've been discussing the possibility of a joint exhibition that would showcase how traditional crafts can address contemporary needs. The response to last winter's Christmas gifts has been extraordinary. People are hungry for objects made with genuine skill and care." Charles took his seat among the group, preferring the informal arrangement to the formal presentations that characterized official royal meetings. These gatherings worked best when they resembled conversations among collaborators rather than audiences seeking royal approval. The relationships had been built through years of mutual respect and shared commitment to maintaining Britain's artisanal traditions. "Tell me more about this exhibition idea," Charles said, accepting a cup of tea from the service set that had been crafted by one of the group members the previous year. "I'm particularly interested in how we might connect your individual specialties with broader educational goals." The conversation that followed revealed the intricate network of relationships that had grown from decades of royal support for traditional crafts. Each artisan represented not just individual skill but a link in chains of knowledge that stretched back generations. Margaret's bookbinding workshop trained young people in techniques that preserved rare manuscripts. James's coopering skills were essential for distilleries and breweries trying to maintain traditional production methods. Eleanor's pottery provided both artistic inspiration and practical objects that would last for generations. "The real challenge," explained David Chen, a furniture maker whose family had immigrated from Hong Kong in the 1960s and adapted traditional Chinese joinery techniques to British hardwoods, "is finding young people who want to learn trades that require years of training and don't promise immediate financial rewards. The Christmas commissions help sustain our workshops through slow periods, but we need apprentices if these skills are going to survive." This concern touched on something Charles had been thinking about throughout the winter visits. The extended Christmas traditions weren't just about maintaining current relationships but about ensuring that valuable knowledge and skills would be available to future generations. Each craft workshop represented a small university where ancient wisdom was adapted to contemporary needs, but only if young people could be attracted to the demanding work of true mastery. "What if we created a formal apprenticeship program?" Charles suggested. Something that would provide young people with meaningful income while they learn, but also connect them to the broader purpose of preserving cultural heritage. The Christmas workshop commissions could serve as a foundation, but we might also develop partnerships with museums, historic properties, and educational institutions. The group's enthusiasm was immediate and practical. They began discussing specific possibilities: how bookbinding skills could support university libraries, how traditional building techniques could address the renovation needs of historic properties, how ancient dyeing and weaving methods could inspire contemporary fashion designers seeking authentic sustainability. Eleanor pulled out a folder containing sketches and photographs. "I've been working on designs for a complete dinner service that could be used for state occasions but also demonstrate how traditional pottery techniques can create objects that are both beautiful and functional. Each piece would tell part of the story of British ceramic traditions, but they would also be practical for actual use." Charles examined the drawings with genuine interest. The designs managed to be both historically informed and completely contemporary, drawing on centuries of British pottery traditions while addressing the practical needs of modern entertaining. The project would require months of work and represent exactly the kind of collaboration between royal patronage and artistic excellence that gave meaning to ceremonial functions. "This is precisely what I hoped would emerge from our Christmas traditions," Charles said. "Objects that carry forward the best of our cultural heritage while serving contemporary purposes. When state guests use these pieces, they'll be experiencing something authentically British that couldn't be created anywhere else in the world." The afternoon continued with detailed planning for projects that would emerge from the winter's relationship building. A master weaver from the Hebrides proposed creating tapestries that would incorporate traditional Highland motifs with contemporary artistic sensibilities. A woodworker from Kent wanted to design furniture for royal residences that would showcase British timber and joinery techniques while meeting modern conservation and comfort requirements. Each project represented the kind of long-term thinking that royal Christmas traditions were designed to encourage. Unlike commercial enterprises focused on quarterly profits or government programs constrained by electoral cycles, royal patronage could support work that might take years to complete and decades to show its full value. The Christmas visits and winter relationship building created the trust necessary for such ambitious collaborations. As the meeting concluded, Charles found himself in conversation with Thomas Wright, a young blacksmith who had inherited his grandfather's forge in rural Northumberland. The workshop had been struggling to survive until royal commissions during the previous Christmas season had provided both financial support and credibility that attracted other clients. "Your Majesty," Thomas said, "I wanted you to know that the Christmas ironwork project changed everything for my business. Not just the immediate income, but the confidence it gave me that traditional smithing skills still have value in the modern world. I've started taking on apprentices again for the first time in years." This was exactly the outcome Charles hoped for from the extended Christmas traditions. The winter visits and ongoing relationships weren't charity or mere sentiment, they were investments in preserving knowledge and skills that could strengthen British culture and economy for generations to come. Each successful artisan represented dozens of potential apprentices, hundreds of future objects that would embody the best of British craftsmanship. The spring evening was mild as the artisans departed, many of them carrying samples and prototypes that would be developed into major projects over the coming months. Charles remained in the drawing room, reviewing notes from the afternoon's discussions and planning follow-up actions that would keep the momentum building through the summer and into the following winter's cycle. His correspondence secretary appeared with the day's final batch of letters, including several from families he had visited during the winter months. Mrs. Campbell had written from her Highland cottage to report that the track repairs he had recommended were proceeding well, and that she was looking forward to his next visit. The Peterson family from Sandringham had sent photographs of their children's academic achievements, noting that encouragement Charles had provided during his January visit had motivated their daughter to apply for university scholarships she had never thought possible. Each letter confirmed that the extended Christmas traditions were accomplishing their fundamental purpose, creating connections that strengthened both the monarchy and the communities it served. The relationships built during winter visits continued to flourish through personal correspondence, ongoing support, and collaborative projects that would benefit both individual families and broader British society. Charles opened his journal to record the day's discussions and plan future actions. The artisan meeting had generated enough ideas for several years of projects, each building on the relationships established during winter months when travel was difficult and casual contact impossible. The spring planning session ensured that winter's investment in human relationships would bear fruit in practical projects that preserved valuable traditions while addressing contemporary needs. The clock chimed 9 as Charles finished his evening correspondence. Tomorrow would bring another round of letters requiring personal responses, more planning sessions for collaborative projects, and continued follow-up on the needs and opportunities identified during winter visits. The third phase of royal Christmas traditions that extended far beyond the holidays required this patient, ongoing work, maintaining relationships through personal attention, developing projects that gave practical expression to shared values, and ensuring that valuable cultural knowledge would survive to inspire future generations. Outside, the spring rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows, nourishing the gardens where traditional plants grew alongside innovative varieties that tested new approaches to sustainable agriculture. Like the artisan workshops and rural families he supported, Charles's own estate served as a laboratory where ancient wisdom met contemporary challenges, where traditional methods were tested against modern needs, and where the patience required for genuine excellence could flourish without the pressure of immediate returns. The extended Christmas traditions represented something rare in contemporary life: the willingness to make long-term investments in human potential without demanding immediate, measurable results. They required faith that personal relationships, carefully nurtured over time, could accomplish things that no amount of money or bureaucratic efficiency could achieve. They demonstrated that the monarchy's greatest value might lie not in ceremony or constitutional function but in its capacity to sustain the kind of patient, generous attention to human needs that made civilization possible. "I want to show you something," Charles said, leading William toward a small clearing where gardeners had prepared the soil for new plantings. "This autumn, we're going to create a grove that represents the extended Christmas tradition network, trees contributed by every family and artisan who has been part of the program, planted together to symbolize how individual relationships can create something larger than their separate parts." The vision was ambitious but achievable: dozens of trees from across Britain, each carrying soil from the places where relationships had been built and projects developed. Highland oaks would grow beside Cotswold beeches, Welsh ash beside Yorkshire sycamores, creating a living map of the connections that had been forged through patient attention to human potential. Future generations would walk among trees that embodied the principle that royal traditions served their highest purpose when they strengthened the bonds between crown and people. "It's perfect," William said, his enthusiasm evident in his voice. "A memorial that celebrates living relationships rather than historical events. Visitors will see how royal Christmas traditions continue to grow and develop, rather than being museum pieces preserved from the past." As they walked back toward the castle, Charles reflected on how profoundly the extended Christmas traditions had changed his understanding of royal duty. The ceremonial aspects of monarchy remained important: the state occasions, constitutional functions, and public appearances that maintained institutional dignity and historical continuity. But the real work of kingship happened during winter visits to isolated families, spring planning sessions with struggling artisans, and summer reviews of projects that would strengthen British communities for generations to come. The evening light was golden as they reached the castle's main entrance, where staff members were already preparing for the following day's activities. Tomorrow would bring visits from educational leaders who wanted to understand how the Christmas Tradition Network could be scaled up to address national challenges in rural development, traditional craft preservation, and early childhood support. The personal relationships Charles had built during winter months were generating policy insights that could influence government programs and charitable initiatives throughout Britain. "There's one more thing to consider," Charles said as they paused on the castle steps. "These extended Christmas traditions are creating a new model for how hereditary institutions can serve democratic societies. We're demonstrating that royal authority, properly used, can accomplish things that elected officials and bureaucratic agencies cannot: the patient, long-term relationship building that enables genuine innovation and cultural preservation." William smiled, understanding the broader implications of what his father was suggesting. It's the difference between performing tradition and living it. When Christmas customs become opportunities for genuine engagement, they generate the kind of trust and collaboration that can address challenges requiring years or decades to resolve. The castle's interior was cool and welcoming after the warm afternoon sunshine. Charles made his way to his private study, where correspondence awaited his attention: letters from families visited during the winter, progress reports from artisan partnerships, and invitations to see projects that had grown from casual conversations during storm-delayed visits to remote cottages. Each piece of mail represented a connection that required ongoing cultivation, a relationship that had moved far beyond ceremonial courtesy into genuine collaboration. The fourth and final phase of royal Christmas traditions that extended far beyond the holiday season was this gradual transformation of personal relationships into institutional change that could benefit society for generations. The winter visits had built trust. The spring planning had developed specific projects. The summer assessments had demonstrated practical value. But the ultimate purpose was creating new ways of thinking about how ancient institutions could serve contemporary needs without losing their essential character. As Charles opened his evening correspondence, he found a letter that captured everything he hoped the extended Christmas traditions could accomplish. It came from Agnes Murray, the elderly textile artist whose workshop he had visited during a February snowstorm. Her arthritis had improved with the medical attention he had arranged, and her workshop was now training 3 young weavers in traditional Highland techniques. But, more importantly, her patterns and methods were being adapted by contemporary fashion designers who wanted to create clothing that honored Scottish heritage while meeting modern sustainability standards. Your Majesty, she had written in her careful script, what began as a simple visit during harsh weather has grown into something that will preserve my family's knowledge for generations while giving it new purpose in a changing world. This is what traditions should do, honor the past while serving the future. Thank you for understanding that keeping customs alive means allowing them to grow. The letter summarized everything Charles believed about royal duty and traditional institutions. Christmas customs that remained frozen in historical forms would eventually become meaningless ceremonial performances. But traditions that maintained their essential spirit while adapting to contemporary needs could serve purposes that no other institution could fulfill. They could create the kind of patient, generous attention to human potential that made civilization possible, that enabled individual gifts to flourish into community benefits, that allowed ancient wisdom to address modern challenges. The extended Christmas traditions represented more than seasonal customs or even relationship-building strategies. They offered a model for how hereditary monarchy could justify its existence in democratic societies by accomplishing things that elected officials and bureaucratic institutions could not achieve. They demonstrated that royal authority, properly understood and carefully exercised, could create value that served everyone's interests while preserving what was most precious about British culture and heritage. Outside, the Highland evenings settled into the deep peace that came after days of useful work and meaningful conversation. Charles knew that tomorrow would bring new letters requiring personal responses, more projects needing careful oversight, and continued development of relationships that had begun during winter visits but would flourish through years of patient attention. The Christmas traditions that had once seemed like burdensome obligations had become the most rewarding aspects of his royal duties, work that connected him directly to the people and purposes that gave monarchy its deepest meaning. The memorial garden held its trees in silhouette against the darkening sky, each one representing choices made by previous generations to invest in futures they would never see. Charles understood now that the extended Christmas traditions served a similar purpose. They were investments in human potential and cultural continuity that would bear fruit long after he was gone, tended by successors who would adapt them to their own times while preserving the essential spirit that made them valuable. The royal Christmas traditions that never ended were really just beginning, growing like the trees he planted each winter into something that could shelter and strengthen British communities for centuries to come.